Our presenter tonight, in case you didn't see it, does have books out in the lobby. Please take a look at those. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Mark Santiago. And he's talking The Labyrinth of Blood, Apaches and the Spanish Empire. I'm going to guess they didn't get along well. And he's going to go into details on those. I think you're going to enjoy the presentation. Please help me welcome Mark Santiago.
Wait till I'm done before you clap, because you don't know what you're going to get here. So thank you, Doug, and thank you, Gary, for that introduction. Talk a little bit about Apaches and the Spanish here, and a lot of people don't know a lot about that. And this is sort of a prelude to the Chronicles of the Apache Wars that Brent Coons did, his book. So you can correct me when I'm wrong and throw things at me, so if you need to. So not too long ago, Paul Hutton wrote a book where he said that the wars between the United States and the Apaches were the longest wars in this region. Well, no. You know, the wars between the United States and the Apaches went from about 1848 to 1886, 38 years. The wars between the Spanish Empire and the Apache peoples date probably from 1632 to about 1821, which is, I don't do math, but that's more than what he said. So I went into history, I don't do numbers. So it begs the question, why are the Spanish and the Apaches like daggers drawn for such a long time? Why are these two people opposed to each other so much? And hope to examine that in this talk. So talk a little bit about the Apaches and the Spanish and the Labyrinth of Blood. It's a good title. Southern Athabascans, the Apaches, the Navajos. Great debate about when they emerge into the Southwest. They come from what would now be Alaska. Some historians push them back to the year about 750 AD. Others say that they're here much later, 1200, 1300. They're clearly here by about 1450, okay? So about 1450, the Apaches are in an area that is basically southern Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. They're floating around there at least by then, if not earlier. And again, I'm not an anthropologist or an archaeologist. There's great debate about exactly when the Apaches come into this area. At least by that time, the Apaches begin to break up into tribal groupings. Again, the L is the Lipan or Lipian. You have the PL is the Plains Apaches. The M is the Mescalero, Jicarilla, the Navajo, who are related to the Apaches very closely, White Mountains Apaches and Western Apaches, and Chiricahua. And so this is generally where they're at, more or less by about 1500, 1550, somewhere in that area. The Apaches have a unique society, and they are extremely independent, and they are very warlike, at least with the Spaniards. And there's a great fluidity of leadership among the Apaches. Our friend, I don't know, Jay Van Orden used to work at the Arizona Historical Society, studied the Apaches a lot, and he said, Jay's line is, there are no Apaches. And why does he say that? And well, the notion of a tribe or a group or a band are often external ideas imposed by outsiders in an attempt to understand Apache society. Such identifications may or may not exist among the Apaches themselves. And even these groupings that we saw before, these are things that are given by Anglo and other anthropologists and archaeologists starting at the earliest, the 1860s, 1870s. It's really hard to tell how the Apaches saw themselves before that time, okay? Because we simply have no records of it. How did they self-identify before anthropologists started lumping them into these groups, okay? And again, the idea that there are no Apaches, you see up there on the screen, it says, one of the Spaniards observed that an Indian who was captured in San Antonio outside of Texas When questioned as to the number of Apache tribes, declared that calling them by their special names, there were 37 tribes with the name Apache just on the vicinity of the road to New Mexico. So between San Antonio and Santa Fe, the Apaches identified themselves as 37 different tribes. Okay, again, that's how they're looking at it, okay, as opposed to how we look at it. It's probably better to look at the Apaches in terms of what's called, or Spanish termed, a rancheria. A rancheria is an extended family group, and it's also a more realistic grouping for individual identity. The Apaches do recognize each other. They do recognize something we might call a tribe. They do recognize other Apaches as being ethnically kin, but it's hard to say. I have cousins from West Virginia, and they divide the world into weans and theyans, okay? Well, with the Apaches, it's hard to say who the weans and theyans are, okay? Among the larger groups and among the rancherias, leadership is often temporary and subject to the whims of individual members. Excuse me. Even forceful personalities and successful leaders hold only ephemeral control. Rarely do individuals manage to hold large numbers of people together for a long time. And even then, an individual is free to disagree and depart at any particular point. Extreme independence influences conflicts, and that individuals can determine when and where they and no one else will go and stay. Okay, so again, it's what I call an atomized society. Any adult male at any time can say, I don't agree with what's going on, and I'm going off. I'm going to do my own thing. Okay? And everybody agrees with that. Nobody has a problem with that. Okay? When it comes to warfare, there are two types of warfare. And again, these are interpretations of 19th century, 20th century American anthropologists. But usually, it seems that the Apaches would wage warfare in two types. One is a raid, and one is what they would call warfare. Raids can be anything from a simple theft of a few guys, going out and grabbing some mules and some horses, all the way up to several hundred guys going out on a major raid to gather things. The motives for raids are prestige, economic gain, and sustenance, which is food. Most of the Apaches, I hope we don't have horse lovers here, they eat horses. Okay? That's one of their favorite foods. Okay? Warfare, on the other hand, is a bit more complicated. Wars are based around the sense of vengeance, what the Italians would call a vendetta. Okay? Apaches feel that the other must pay for any loss that they suffer, individually or collectively. And it doesn't matter that the other is actually the person who caused their loss. Okay? So that a Spaniard 100 miles away from a place where one Spaniard killed an Apache may find himself a victim of these same Apaches because the other must pay. And it doesn't matter that it's the guy who did it, it's just the other, okay? This is something totally incomprehensible to people raised in Western civilization, okay? The Spaniards, the Mexicans, the Americans. The idea is the guilty party is to suffer, not the group which contains the guilty party. The Apaches, this is irrelevant. The other must pay in a collective sense in order to balance or repay the loss they have suffered. And still there is no final payment. Vengeance could be exacted as long as one felt aggrieved. So vengeance could continue for a long time and involve many different attacks. Geronimo, in the story of his life, written in the early 1900s, talks about how when his first wife and family were killed by the Mexicans, somewhere around 1850, he talked about, whenever I saw anything to remind me, he said, of my former happy days, my heart would ache for revenge. So Geronimo, as an example, up until 1886, was killing people because of something that happened in the 1850s, because he still felt angry. And in Apache society, that was justified. Okay. Let's talk about the Spaniards coming. Okay, the first Spaniards come with Cortez, 1519, 1521. They conquer the Aztec Empire, the great riches and wealth of the Aztec Empire. And there is the fabled search for un otro Mexico, another Mexico. Rumors that there are great lands in the interior that the Spaniards have not encountered, and that they're going to go and see if they can find another Mexico. Okay. The first expedition to reach this area where the Apaches are is the expedition, the remnants of the expedition of Panfilo de Narvaez. He came from Cuba. Most of his guys, they land in Florida. They try to make it to the Mississippi. They build rafts. Most of them die on the rafts, and very few of them survive, one of which is Cabeza de Vaca, the famed castaway with Estevantes and his few other, about 4 companions, who travel all the way, basically from Galveston down, all the way over, basically everywhere throughout the Southwest, wandering around, trying to get back home. In their wanderings, they heard tales of great Indian cultures in the interior, somewhere in the interior. This, of course, then triggers the expedition of Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, who again leads an army in search of, for one time he would call Cibola, okay, the famed 7 cities of gold, which of course there aren't any 7 cities of gold. However, there are cities, and what he comes upon is the Puebloan peoples of New Mexico and Arizona. And of course, their Spanish are quite disappointed by this, but they accepted. The Spanish are looking for Indians who are settled down and who have some level of what the Spaniards would consider civilization. And the main facet that they consider civilized is people who are agricultural and who live in close-knit communities like the Puebloan peoples of New Mexico. They live in towns, they have intense agriculture, and the Spanish figure these guys are fairly civilized, what we would recognize as civilized, okay? As the Spaniards exert their power over the Puebloan peoples, they continue out into the Llano Estacado and up into Kansas and Nebraska and those places. And along the way, they find a people who they call Querachos, who are probably the ancestors of the Apaches, okay? And these are people who do come in from time to time, and they trade with the Puebloan peoples in New Mexico. They trade buffalo hides, they trade buffalo meat, they trade lard in exchange for carbohydrates, in exchange for corn and other things that they can't get just from the meat diet that they're on. One of the chroniclers of the Pedro de Castañeda of the Coronado expedition says that they are a gentle people and not cruel. And we'll see the Spanish will change their minds about this quite rapidly. 60 some odd years after Coronado, there are a few other Spanish expeditions to the southwest, but not until about 1600, 1598 to 1601, does Juan de Oñate come in and actually exert physical control, basically conquers what would now be New Mexico, the Puebloan peoples of New Mexico. Overwhelmed by Oñate's military might, the Puebloan peoples are basically forced to submit, and the Spanish established the Kingdom of New Mexico, as it is called, very far to the north of its other places. This is just interesting. This is you can go to inscription rock in New Mexico, and you see this. This is Paso por aquí el adelantando de Don Juan de Oñate, el descubrimiento de la Mar del Sur. This is they're passed this way, the adelantando Don Juan de Oñate, in discovering of the Sea of the South. He's looking for the Pacific, and he found the Sea of Cortez, essentially, so theoretically he did. So after Oñate, the Spanish begin to deal with the Apaches, such as they are, mainly through the Puebloan peoples, okay? The people that Oñate calls, he names vaqueros, or he used the word Apaches, okay? These are probably the Carachos that Coronado discovered or found 60 years earlier, okay? While all this is going on, amalgamations, literal and social, and social begin to occur. In Mexico, in the Viceroyalty of New Spain, which is what Mexico is, the mining frontier begins to expand, especially after 1554, when the amalgamation process is discovered or introduced to New Spain. Invented by a guy by the name of Bartolome de Medina in Pachuca, the patio process, as it's called. Silver ores are crushed, typically either in arrastras or stamp mills. Let me just back up. You can see the mining frontier begins here. It begins to go north, Zacatecas, Durango, Corral. Up here will be Chihuahua. Okay, so gradually the Spanish are moving, following mining after mine, okay? The patio process we talked about is where silver ore is crushed in arrastras. Here's an example of the patio process. These are areas where they will have mules come in. They'll put crush the silver ore, mix it with salt, water, and magistral, which is basically copper sulfate, and mercury, and spread it into a 1 to 2 foot thick layer in a patio, a shallow circle like you see there. Horses were driven around the patio to further mix the ingredients, and after several weeks of mixing and soaking in the sun, a complex reaction converted the silver to native metal, which formed an amalgam with the mercury, okay? Heating this amalgam drives off the mercury, leaving the silver, okay? What this does is it allows the Spanish to get even fairly low-grade silver ore, and with the amalgam process, they can extract the silver from it. So that these silver mines, back up 1 second here, these silver mines going north all the way to about Chihuahua begin to produce an incredible amount of wealth. Probably between 1650 and 1800, the mines in Mexico produce approximately a quarter of the silver used in all the world, okay? The silver mines in Mexico are the richest silver deposit ever owned by a single nation ever, okay? There's a lot of money, okay? However, this is the pre-industrial period, right? So, mining is hard, laborious, time-consuming, and you need labor for it, okay? You need people to work the mines, okay? While the Spanish begin to use the amalgamation process, they begin to grab any Indians that they can to work the mines, even if necessarily enslaving them, okay? As a result of this, different native groups begin to amalgamate on their own. They begin to form larger groupings for self-protection, okay? So as the amalgamation process spurs the northern silver frontier, there's also an amalgamation of native peoples to resist the Spaniards. Okay. Oops. We interrupt our program. Okay. Get my act together here again. Unfortunately, it's not an act.
The last time that happened, one of the speakers, you couldn't get the pages in there.
Well, fortunately, my wife always insisted that I remember these things. It's been just such an emergency. Bear with me, and I apologize. Okay. Where was I before I was so rudely interrupted? Okay. Apaches in the Kingdom of New Mexico. The drive of the silver powers to the north would eventually reach New Mexico, and it's in New Mexico that we begin to see the really first intense interaction between Apaches and Spaniards. For almost 70 years after Oñate and the Puebloans meet, Puebloan peoples endure Spanish rule and misrule. The Apaches, who have been dealing with the Puebloans for many generations before the Spaniards arrived, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as trading partners, sometimes as slavers. They would trade slaves back and forth. They don't really figure out the Spanish and what to do with the Spanish. But the Spanish figure out what to do with the Apaches. That's just to enslave them. They wage war against the Apaches. Several of the New Mexico governors will go out and justify taking the Apaches as slaves to work in their own obrajes or sweatshops, and they'll trade blankets that the Puebloans work for stuff that they need. They'll also trade the slaves back into Nueva Vizcaya, back to the south, to work in the mines. Okay. So from about 1600 to about 1660, there's this nascent, ongoing warfare between the Apaches and the Spaniards and the Puebloans. The Spaniards will have the Puebloan peoples, like the people of Picaris, for example, will go out on slave raids and attack Apaches and then bring the slaves back, sell them to the Spaniards who sell them farther south. Okay. So you have Indian on Indian slavery occurring on a more or less constant basis. The Apaches themselves will then turn to slaving. They will enslave people farther out on the plains, Caddoan peoples, Wichita people, Utes, who they'll then trade to the Spaniards, okay, to get stuff that they want. These slave trades become so common that when the Apaches will come into the trade fairs at Taos and other places, the Spanish begin to use the term rescate, which means a ransoming, because the priest in New Mexico will say, you've got to buy these people, and the Apaches figure this out really quick. The Apaches will say, I've got these Caddoan people I want to sell to you, and the Spanish will say, well, I'm not interested in this. So, well, if you don't buy them, we're going to kill them. No, I don't believe you. And they'll kill them. They'll kill them in front of the Spaniards. And the priest will go, no, you can't let them do that. You've got to buy those people. And so they do. Okay? And the Apaches realize this is a good deal. Okay? And they begin to slave even more. Okay? By about 1660, these back and forth becomes more and more aggressive as the Apaches begin, stimulated by the slave trade and others, begin to exert control, economic control, over the Great Plains. They begin to push out a people called Humanos, who had been a trading people before them, and the Apaches begin to take over, as it were, these regions. Things are still okay for a bit until about the year 1680, when there is the Great Pueblo Revolt. Okay. In 1680, Pope, this is fanciful version of Pope that's in the Statuary Hall in Washington. It's one of New Mexico's two statues that each state is allowed to have. Leads a great revolt against the Spaniards. The Spaniards are driven south out of most of New Mexico, driven south to about where El Paso, Texas is now. And for about 13 years, the Puebloans have regained their freedom, okay? Until about the year 1693, this man, Don Diego de Vargas, leads the reconquest, the Reconquista of New Mexico, leads the Spanish forces back, it defeats the Puebloans, and reestablishes Spanish authority over the province of New Mexico. The results of this great northern revolt, as it is called, is that the Apaches begin to attack both Puebloans and Spaniards. And the Spaniards and the Apaches, who had 10 years before been at daggers drawn with each other, make an alliance out of mutual convenience, and the Spaniards and the Puebloans are allies against the Apaches and against the Navajo, who have begun to break off and become pastoralists. It's difficult at what point do the Spanish distinguish between the Navajos as a different people and the Apaches proper. Indeed, for most of the 17th and 18th century, they refer to them as Apache de Navajo. And Apaches and Navajos are ethnically similar. I've known some Navajo people and I know some Apache people, and they can talk back and forth and they can understand each other, okay? It's similar to, say, someone speaking Italian and Spanish. They can kind of make out what it is, even though they're basically different languages, okay? So by about the beginning of the 18th century, the Apaches have crushed all the other peoples on the plains, and they have begun to establish what will be called El Gran Apacheria, the Great Apache Lands, okay? And they begin to absorb other people. This quote, which I'll read just very quickly, says, this is a captain from the Presidio of Janos, says, we've seen how the Janos, Jacomes, Mansos, Sumas, Chinaras, and Apaches have united. We have seen their great number and how they always travel together and how they never leave the rugged Sierras where they always have their habitation. From the mountain peaks, they are able to do whatever they wish and we are not able to punish them because the rebels have united for this purpose on these frontiers and those of Sonora. The amalgamation has taken place. The Apaches have basically absorbed all of these other peoples who had been independent, theoretically, by about the beginning of the 18th century. This is the area of Spanish control, actual Spanish control, 17th and 18th century. You can see some isolated areas around San Antonio, here, along Gulf Coast here. Here's El Paso, Albuquerque up to Taos, Zuni, Tubac, Punta del Rios. Again, the Spanish are moving up this. This is what they actually control as opposed to what they claim. And the Gran Apacheria is basically in all this area here, okay? A decade after the Pueblo Revolt, the Apaches had become the dominant tribe in the Southern Plains, basically crushed everybody else. During the Pueblo Revolt, they acquired large numbers of horses that the Spanish had left behind or they stole, so they become fully equestrian. They also begin to learn from the Puebloan peoples, and they begin to practice agriculture on a large scale, especially in the areas around the large rivers, the Platte, the Red River. They begin to have seasonal plantings. This leads to a great expansion, great population expansion of the Eastern Apaches. The Apaches, unfortunately, enjoy their superiority probably for less than a generation. Because beginning about 1707, perhaps a little bit earlier, the Comanches emerge. Okay? Yeah, if you're an Apache and the people say Comanche, go, oh. You know, they're pretty frightened about the the Comanches, as well as they should be. Emerging from the Rocky Mountains, again about 1700, 1710, the Comanches begin to aggressively try to take over all of the southern Buffalo Plains, and they succeed. Okay? The Comanches are in an interesting location in that they're close enough to the Mississippi River, they get close enough to the Mississippi River, that they can trade with those peoples for guns. Okay? They're also able to breed their own horses, and by about 1720, they are fully mounted and equipped with firearms. Okay? By 1720, because of their control of the Buffalo Plains, their use of horses in hunting, their diet becomes extremely dependent on protein, okay? And protein is good for doing stuff, including fighting and making babies, okay? And they make a lot of babies. By about 1720, there are about 40,000 Comanches. It's a huge number, okay? They probably outnumber the Apaches 3 to 1. And they've got guns. Fierce and aggressive with access to French and British trade goods, especially firearms, the Comanches soon demonstrate a marked military superiority over the Apaches. Apache slaves become a crucial part of the Comanche economy. The Comanches will attack the Apaches, who again are semi-agriculturalists. They're along the Platte River, the Red River. They have seasonal agricultural growings there. The Apaches will try to defend their agricultural places. The Comanches are mobile. They don't have to defend any place, so they can attack the Apaches when they're weakest, which they do year after year after year after year. Battle of attrition takes place. The Apaches gradually lose. The more the Apaches lose, the more the Comanches take Spanish slaves, mostly women. They sell them to the Osage, to the Wichita, to the Caddo, and to the French in Louisiana. In exchange, they get guns and more horses. Apache slaves are one of the keys to Comanche domination. Again, Indian slavery feeding on itself. The Comanches come to hate the Apaches like you wouldn't believe. Throughout this era, again, the conquest, as late as 1785, the Comanches tell the commander of the Spanish soldiers in San Antonio, "We are very content, particularly knowing that our father, the Capitan Grande at San Antonio, does not like the Apaches nor Lapans, against whom we make war whenever we can find them." Okay. At this time, same time that the Apaches are crumbling before the Apaches, they're brushing up against the Spanish coming from the south. The Apaches, quite cleverly, approach the Spaniards and ask them to help them become Christians. This is what the Spaniards are all about. Do the Apaches want to become Christians? Apaches want the Spaniards to help them fight the Comanches, okay? And they'll say or do whatever they have to do in order to get the Spanish help against the Apaches. The Spanish encounter the Apaches as either violent warriors ready-made for slavery or as benighted heathen ripe for Christianization. At the eastern end of the Llano Estacado, the Spanish turn to the Spanish for support, and in 1758, Spanish will establish a mission at a presidio nearby, near Menard, Texas, for those of you who are interested, called San Saba, famous painting of the destruction of San Saba. The Spanish build these missions. There's a presidio nearby. They hope to congregate the Apaches and Christianize them, turn them into Catholics. It was all a big ruse. The Apaches don't show up. Spanish are wondering for 6, 8, 10 months, where are the Apaches? We're here to Christianize them. Well, the Apaches don't go there. Why? Because they had the Spanish build their area in the middle of Comanche territory. Okay? On March 16th, 1758, 2,000 Comanches and their allies of the nations of the north destroy the Spanish settlement and the mission at San Saba. They don't kill very many people, 10, 12, but it's their way of showing, hey, we can do what we want. The Spanish Presidio, which is nearby, has about 100 men in it. They're fairly well armed. You know what they figure out? They got more guns than we do. They got more guns, they got more horses, and there are a lot more of them than there are of us. Why are we out here? Okay. Indeed, at one point, a Spanish inspector will look at the Presidio near, it's called Presidio San Saba, and says that this Presidio has all the utility for the king as a galleon anchored in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Okay? Serves no purpose. Okay? The Spanish feel betrayed, rightly so, and the experiment of Christianizing the Apaches goes away. Simultaneously, farther south, other Apaches, not the eastern ones from the plains, but Mescaleros, Jicarillas, Chiricahua, begin to attack Spanish settlements which are moving north in what would now be Sonora, Nueva Vizcaya. It would be the provinces of Chihuahua, Sonora, and Arizona, Mexico to a certain extent. Between 1749 and 1763, Apache attacks in and around the town of Chihuahua, the Villa of Chihuahua. Within a 200-mile radius, it resulted in more than 800 deaths and destroyed over 4 million pesos worth of property. A Spanish captain, go back a second, says that the Apaches wash over this land like the waves of the sea. Okay? The Spanish, after failing in Texas, of these attacks in the center, determined to crush the Apaches. And they feel that they are their primary enemy in the northern frontier. All this is well and good. Has nothing to do, as far as the King of Spain cares, they could care less. Okay? And the fate of the Apaches and the Spanish on this interior and the northern frontier is decided a world away in what is known as the French and Indian War. Okay? The French and Indian War sees initially France versus England, other European powers. Eventually Spain is drawn in. You can see the areas of conflict: North America, Europe, India, the Philippines. It's a world war, okay? And the French and the Spanish lose. Okay? The British win, okay? At the end of the war in 1763, the King of Spain, Charles III, realizes that his empire is vulnerable. He simply does not have the manpower, because the Spanish Empire is huge, simply does not have the manpower to station troops everywhere, and that the British, who control the seas, can strike wherever and whenever they want. Okay? In order to deal with this situation, he launches what are known as the Bourbon Reforms, okay? Which takes place throughout the Spanish Empire, and at this time the Spanish control almost most of South America except for Brazil, all of Central America, Mexico, much of the American Southwest, okay? After the war, they in exchange, because they lost Florida to the British, they get the Louisiana Territory, which will later be the Louisiana Purchase. That becomes Spanish territory as well, okay? King Charles realizes he has to reinvigorate his military, and he has to get more money out of the mines in Mexico to build up a native military. You know, for example, there'll be Mexican soldiers in Mexico fighting for the Spaniards, and, you know, soldiers in Colombia fighting for they don't call themselves Colombian yet, but throughout the Spanish Empire, the locals are now being brought into the Spanish army. And Charles's advisors will say, well, you know, there's a danger that these people may at some day take up the arms that we're going to give them and turn them against us, seek independence, which they will. But Charles is more afraid of the British than he is of a future revolution among his own people. And so he brings about these reforms. Along this area where we're at now, the Spanish begin to form what's called the interior provinces of New Spain, okay? Las Provincias Internas, okay? And beginning in about 1765, after some rearrangements, they decide to establish a separate military command throughout the region, going from California all the way to what would now be Louisiana, okay? Along this frontier, they realize fairly quickly on that they don't have to really worry about any other Europeans, okay? They've got Louisiana, and so the British and the Americans are to the east of the Mississippi. They start to get California. They really don't have to worry about maybe some Russians and people coming down there. But in this area, this central area, there really are no European threats at this point. The people that they have to deal with are native peoples, and especially the Apaches, because the Apaches are still running along this entire area here. Comanches are up here, the Apaches are all the way along here. Comanches are still pushing the Apaches against Spanish territory. And so the Spanish recognize it's the Apaches who are our main enemy in this region. The interior provinces, as they are called, and just, you know, they are Sonora, which includes part of Arizona, Sonora, Nueva Vizcaya, which is what would be now Chihuahua and Durango, the states of Chihuahua and Durango, New Mexico, Coahuila, Nuevo Leon, Nueva Santander, which goes up to areas in Texas, and then Texas itself farther over here, okay? These are the interior provinces, okay? And they become a militarized zone, okay? They're placed under a military commander, and the first military commander is an Irishman. We'll get into why the Spanish have Irishmen, but that has to do with Catholicism. But the first commander of this new frontier zone is a guy by the name of Hugo O'Connor. The Spanish call him Hugo O'Connor, okay? He is the commandant inspector of the interior provinces, and he is given authority to confront the Apaches. Read a little terrible story here. If anybody has a squeamish stomach, bear with me. O'Connor, when he first got to Chihuahua, began to go through the archives, began to look at all the list of Apache depredations. And he came across one at a place called the Rancho del Portero, which was about 15 miles from the villa of Chihuahua City, where there had been a report that the Apaches had attacked and killed everybody in the rancho. And the civil authorities organized a group of men to go out there and see what had happened and to recover the bodies and bring them back for decent burial. But even for men hardened by the violence of the frontier, the scene they came upon was shocking. The mayordomo of the rancho, a mulatto named Ramon Gonzalez, was found with 4 lance thrusts in the chest, his genitals hacked off and stuffed in his mouth, arrows pushed into his rectum. Nearby lay a widow named Hannah Ortega, pierced through the breast with 3 lance thrusts, the womb destroyed, and within it they filled with beans, and in the privy parts they stuck in a bow, leaving this outraged body totally naked. The bodies of 14 other residents, including 3 Tarahumara Indians who worked at the ranch, were scattered about. Among the dead were 9 children, the oldest of which appeared to be about 7 years old, the rest smaller, until the youngest, a newborn of 3 to 4 months. A short distance outside the buildings, they found the body of Joseph Manuel Gonzalez Zamora, a youth of about 13 years old, his whole body run through with 10 lance thrusts, his hair pulled out by the roots from the skull. After scalping the boy, his killers had cut off the thumb and forefinger of his right hand and stuck them on the top of the scalped head, placed in the sign of the cross. The marauders had destroyed everything, killing all the sheep and cattle, the chickens, and even the cats and the dogs. As he read through this list of depredations, O'Connor felt in his own mind that the Apaches were, as a people, barbarous in the extreme. In characterizing the Apaches in his own report, he stressed their ferocity and described them with vicious hyperbole. The cruelty of the barbarians, he wrote, spared no one, regardless of age or sex, even ripping infants from the breasts of their mothers and even from the womb, and executing on their bodies the most detestable excesses. Whether or not O'Connor knew or cared if the Spaniards committed equally detestable excesses against the Apaches was in reality a moot point. Decades and decades of violence and warfare had led both people to the place where they were inured to the vagaries of guilt or innocence. Extraordinarily ferocious acts failed to garner much attention anymore, and even the most detestable excesses were now seen only as one more reason to crush the enemy. Okay? True nature of war. O'Connor is tasked with building what is known as the line of presidios, which is a cordon of posts running along the course of the Rio Grande until about this area here, and then it begins to follow in a rough line the 30th parallel, which is the modern international boundary. Okay? If you look at the line of presidios, it is very close to the modern international boundary. Okay? This is the land the Spanish actually control. Okay? Everything above it, even though there's places beyond the line like Santa Fe and San Antonio, again, they're called beyond the line. Okay? It takes them several years to build these presidios, this line of presidios, which are meant to be defensive in many ways, but O'Connor's different. O'Connor sees these as, to use a modern American anachronism, these are forward operating bases. He sees them as places to launch attacks into the Apache heartlands. And in 1775, the winter of 75-76, in the winter of 1776-77, he launches two massive campaigns, series of envelopments, all the way from Sonora, all the way through Texas, into this area, to attack the Apaches in their own lands, to give the Apaches a taste of what they've been giving to the Spaniards. It is quite successful. Okay? However, this is where the Spanish begin to mess up. In 1777, O'Connor is replaced by this gentleman, the Teodoro de Croix. He was known as the Caballero de Croix, a Frenchman, actually a Belgian, who takes the exact opposite approach that O'Connor took. He feels that he needs to have a defense in depth, and that the Spanish don't need to attack, they need to defend. This attitude is reinforced when in 1779, the Spanish crown goes to war against Great Britain in the War of the American Revolution. Okay? And he's ordered to maintain himself on the defense, to save money mostly. When he goes on defense, the attacks in the Apache homeland stops. The Apaches begin to think, we're winning. They stopped. Things are good. Well, violence escalates. After Troy retires in 1783, there's a little bit of an interregnum, but eventually in 1785, this gentleman becomes the Viceroy of New Spain. He's Bernardo de Galvez, who had led the Spanish forces against the British in the American Revolution, had taken the city of Pensacola and places like Mobile, Alabama, which you didn't realize the Spanish actually had there, and became the Viceroy of New Spain, and had a different idea about how to handle Apaches. His idea was called, or eventually would become, what would be known as the velvet glove and the mailed fist, okay? A combination of these, okay? Galvez, when he was in Louisiana, had seen how the French and the British, and then later the Americans, had manipulated the native peoples there by giving them guns, giving them alcohol, giving them things that would debilitate their societies, so that they could be controlled more easily. Okay? So Galvez begins to think we should try this in the interior provinces. He comes up with the idea that we should wage basically a war against the Apaches that will be unremitting, but will offer different groups of Apaches the incentive to ally with us against other groups of Apaches. Okay? And in exchange, we will give them alcohol, limited use of firearms, and ask that they settle near our presidios, where they will become our allies. Okay? Those who refuse, we will crush. Those who accept, we will gradually debilitate. Okay? Quite interesting. And again, probably a policy that would have worked. He puts his policy out in 1786 and then promptly dies. Okay? After he dies, there's what I call the confusion of powers. Because he was the viceroy, he can control everything, he made two commanders, two commandant generals, one for the eastern interior provinces and one for the western interior provinces. The idea was, of course, he's sitting back in Mexico City, and he can control these guys and coordinate what they do, and again go back into this sort of things like O'Connor was doing, attacking the Apaches on a regular basis, but he'll run it all. But he's dead. Okay? And after he dies, the guys after him kind of go their own way, and the eastern and western commandants generals begin to have different opinions of how to deal with the Apaches. Okay? And they're basically diametrically opposed to each other. The guys in the east will favor what O'Connor did, unremitting war against the Apaches. The guys in the west will think, well, maybe we should try to attract the Apaches into settlements nearby and deal with them. With the Apaches, nothing. The Apaches are many things, but they're not fools. Okay? Play this off against each other. Okay? The guys in the east are giving us a hard time, but the guys in the west are pretty light. Let's go over here. Meanwhile, we'll still attack the guys in the east. When we'll go to the west. The guys in the west will shelter us, give us food, give us some guns, and then we'll go attack the guys in the east. Okay? Dueling ideas. Okay? Oop, wrong way. The guys in the east, one of which is by the name of Brigadier Juan de Ugalde, has had it with the Apaches. And after one of them tried to grab him in a parley, he became extremely angry, and he decided that he would use everything in his power against them. He has this famous quote that against Apaches, he would use perfidy against perfidy, deceit against deceit, cunning against cunning. He would lure them in for peace talks and then massacre them. Okay? Hold their women and children hostages, pretend to trade them. When they came in to swap them, then massacre them. Other Spaniards are like shocked. Spaniards have a sense of honor, and they go, this is not right. Too bad. Okay? So this constant warfare, this constant division between the velvet glove and the mailed fist begins to plague Spanish authorities, and explains why there's an uptick in violence and nothing actually gets done. Until about 1792-93, when for reasons totally unrelated to this, the Spanish once again reunite the eastern and western interior provinces under a single commander, a guy by the name of Pedro de Nava. Nava believes in the ideas of Galvez, and he's going to put them into operation. He comes up with two major ideas. One is that he will encourage what are known as establecimientos de paz, or peace establishments, reservations. He basically is going to have the Apaches establish reservations outside of Spanish presidios, where they will be allied with the Spanish and used to fight other Apaches. If they decide not to do this, he will wage unrelenting war against them to the point where he will eliminate one of the major facets of this war, which was prisoners exchange. Okay? It was very common for the Apaches and the Spanish to swap prisoners. Okay? Nava says we're going to stop this. Okay? What we're going to do from now on, and the Spanish have done this before, but he accelerates it. Anytime the Apaches are taken in captivity, we're not going to swap them out. We're going to shackle them, we're going to ship them to Mexico City, and then we're going to ship them to Cuba. And they're going to work on the fortifications of the great city of Havana until they die. Okay? And we're going to let the Apaches know that. We're going to let them know that if you continue fighting against us and we catch you, you're not getting exchanged back after a couple years. You're going to go back to a place and never be heard of again. Okay? And he does it. Two routes, if you will, where the Spanish begin to gather Apaches, those captured in the west, Chiricahua, White Mountain, maybe Mescalero, shipped down to Guadalajara, then over to Mexico City, then to Veracruz, and then off to Havana. Those in the east will be gathered to a place called Santa Rosa, then through Monterrey, Saltillo, that area. Again, the same route, shipped off back to Havana. It's estimated that there's probably about 2,000 Apache men, women, and children who were placed in these colleras and sent into exile. The Spanish will actually treat them and afford them the title of prisoners of war. Prisoners of war have certain rights. You can't kill them outright. Okay? You have to feed them. You have to clothe them. It doesn't mean you got to send them back home. And that's exactly what they do. They will get these people. Many of them will survive. They'll ship them off to Cuba or to Veracruz, and they're going to stay there for the rest of their lives. And they let the Apaches know. A couple of Apaches will go. There's a great story where a group of Apaches is accompanying one of these colleras that's going to Mexico City to retrieve a couple of their relatives. And the Spanish say, come on, we'll let you do that. They bring them to Mexico City. They find their 4 or 5 relatives, women and children. They return them to them. And the Apaches said, what about these other people? Adios, muchacho. They're heading back out. Get out of here and go tell what you saw. Okay? Applied terror. Okay? It works. Okay? The other side of the coin, wrong way. Other side of the coin is the establecimiento system. Gosh, I guess I'm going the wrong way here. Pardon me. Everybody does it. Okay, there we go. Yep, mess it up. One more, come on. The Spanish will establish these reservations, establishmentos they call them. You can see where they're at. This is La Junta, this is Presidio del Norte or Ojinaga. Okay, Presidio, Texas, right here. Okay. Carrizal, San Elizario, which is outside of El Paso. Janos, Bacalachi, Fronteras, which is just south of Douglas, and Tucson have Apache reservations. Okay. At the reservations, the Apaches will be given food on a regular basis. They'll be pretty much left to their own devices. The Spanish will say you have to stay in a particular area. If you want to go out and hunting, you have a license. We'll give you a license. And if you want to go out in warfare, guess what? You guys here in Tucson, we're going to go up and attack the Aravipos. How about you help us? Okay. And they'll serve as scouts for the Spanish. Okay. You'll have Chiricahua Apaches attacking Western Apaches. You'll have Chiricahua Apaches attacking Mescaleros. You'll have Mescaleros attacking Lipans, and vice versa. Okay. Divide and rule. Okay. By 1793, there we we go. There are 8 reservations, and about 1,100 to 1,500, depends, the Apaches come and go. Close to between 1,500 to 1,000 or 2,000 Apaches are reservation Apaches, okay? Things are going pretty well, at least Nava thinks so, until, get it going here again. There we go. Until 1795, when, for various and sundry reasons, several mescaleros of peace revolt in 2 different places. They attack, they kill a bunch of Spanish soldiers, and there's an uprising. The mescaleros are going to go to war again. Okay, Nava says we'll go to war again. For 4 years, Nava will launch aggressive and devastating attacks against the mescaleros. He will launch, like O'Connor did, he will launch attacks in the late fall, early spring, when they're going to go out to the Great Plains and hunt buffalo. And he'll attack them when they're going to feed themselves. Okay? In between then, in those 2 periods, he'll send out smaller parties to raid them in their own homelands. The process is devastating. After about 4 years, close to 1,000 Apache, men, women, and children, are killed, captured, and deported. Maybe 5,000 mescaleros. That's 20% of the population. Okay? War of attrition destroys what we would call their commissariat. Okay? They cannot feed themselves. Okay? And so eventually, what do? They surrender, and they go back to the reservation. And the Spaniards, let it be known to all the other Apaches, say, look and learn. Okay? If necessary, we have the power to crush you, and we will. Okay? Unless you go back to the reservation. Okay? After the bad peace and the good war, between about 1800 to about 1820 or so, the system works. There will be no other major outbreaks of the Apaches. Okay? The Spanish begin to term 2 types of Apaches. Manso Apache, which means tame Apache, and Bronco Apache, which means wild Apache. Okay? And they treat them this way. Okay? The Manso Apaches, they will begin to acculturate in any way that they can. Okay? You can see some, I'll just read these quick, I don't know if you can see it. Lieutenant Antonio Cordero, describing the Apaches at Janos, says, they have accompanied our expeditions with vigor, carrying out the most gallant feats of combat, and have been made against their own compatriots. Okay, divide and roll. Another says their sincerity is further assured by 6 set of enemy ears, which Natural Nalte collected personally. He's talking about a Pinal Apache who came into Tucson saying, I'm here to join you guys, and here's 6 sets of ears from Bronco Apaches to show I'm serious. Okay? A Spanish priest observed that the Apaches in Tucson, they greet one another with Ave Maria Santissima, Hail Mary, full of grace. Okay? And there is no instances of their having hurt anyone. The Tohono O'odham, lifelong ancient enemies, begin to refer to the Apaches as Wankonye Aup, baptized enemies. Okay? The Spanish have essentially begun to acculturate large numbers of Apaches. Okay? Another Spanish priest, observing them, says, it's great, they are now full of new vices, learned among those very same persons who are called Christians, in addition to those they have committed in their pagan state. It seems that these latter, at least the chief ones, such as robbery and murder, have been corrected. Okay. Well, for most Spaniards, the fact that the Apaches are not robbing and murdering was enough. Okay. Nevertheless, the Spanish will continue to employ naked military force on a regular basis and will remain the bedrock of Spanish policy to the Apaches. As late as 1809, Zebulon Pike, when he's been captured and is being brought to Chihuahua, writes that around 9 o'clock, an officer arrived from Santa Rosa, a presidio in Coahuila, with 24 men and 2 Apaches in irons. They were noble-looking fellows of large stature and appeared no means cast down by their misfortunes, although they knew their fate was transportation beyond the sea, never more to see their friends and relations. Okay? Again, stay in the reservation or be deported across the seas to a slow, lingering death. Okay? The success of the Spanish policies is clear. In the period from about 1800 to about 1805, even in areas like Sonora, outside of Tucson, Tubac, in areas around Santa Rita de Cobre, which is where Silver City, New Mexico is, the Spanish expand. They're expanding into Apache territory, and there is general peace reigning throughout the region. However, the higher you rise, the harder you fall. The system works very well until 1821, which is when Mexico gains its independence from Spain. After Mexico gains its independence from Spain, the whole system collapses. Within a period of about 6 years, Mexico goes from being an empire under Iturbide to being a decentralized government to being a strongly centralized federal government. In the midst of all this, there's military officers attacking each other, Praetorian coups continue. I think there's something like 12 governments in Mexico in 11 years. Okay? There's chaos in the central government, and the chaos is felt on the edges. Okay? The Apaches themselves want to maintain the system. The Apaches themselves don't want to see it broken down, but it doesn't work. The central government is not giving money, it's not giving support, it's not saving soldiers, and so they simply can't, for whatever reason. The Apaches aren't getting food, they're not getting shelter, they're not getting guns, they can't do anything. By 1831, the Apaches begin to leave the reservations. And what do? They go back to what they used to do. Raids, extortion, murder, war. Okay? Even though the Mexicans will try, up until at least the 1840s, to try to establish, bring them back to their own areas. This is a great quote. This is Francisco Narbona of the Presidio of Santa Cruz in Sonora, writing to the commander at Janos. He says, "How can you be surprised that I've entered your territory when your own Apaches cross over to our territory in droves to plunder and kill in Sonora?" Okay? The Chiricahuas in Sonora think that they're okay to be in Sonora. They can go into Chihuahua and kill there. At the same time, the Mescaleros in Chihuahua think they can go into Sonora and kill there. And the governments of neither state are strong enough to stop them. Okay? The system essentially is destroyed. The great tragedy of this is that after 1848, the Apaches, although they will remember the establishmentos, when the Americans arrive in the 1840s, they will try to negotiate with the Americans through the prism of the views that they had of the establishmentos. The Americans are ignorant of the Spanish. They don't know that they happened. They have no idea. So the Americans will be set out a form of control and adaptation for the Apaches out of whole cloth. It will, in certain aspects, very closely resemble what the Spaniards had done. There will be reservations, like the establishmentos. They will give regular weekly or monthly rations, like at the establishmentos. They will be placed on specified tribal areas, reservations. They will recruit Apaches as scouts to fight other Apaches. and the Americans will have plans for gradual acculturation, if not assimilation, of the Apaches, all of which the Spaniards had implemented, tried, and came within an ace of succeeding. And in the end, like the Spaniards before them, the Americans will have to negotiate their own way through the labyrinth of blood with the Apaches. Thank you very much.